When the first waves of American Marines from the 1st Division came ashore on Guadalcanal that early morning of August 7, 1942, they carried with them an assortment of weaponry that would fundamentally alter the nature of close combat in the Pacific theatre. Among the standard-issue Garands and Browning automatic rifles, certain Marines had been equipped with something that would catch the Japanese defenders completely unprepared: Winchester Model 12 pump-action shotguns. These weapons represented a capability that Imperial Japanese military doctrine had simply never accounted for in their defensive planning. The pre-dawn landing at Beach Red proceeded with the organized chaos typical of amphibious assaults. Marines moved inland through the darkness, pressing forward from their beachhead toward the interior positions near the Lunga River, where Japanese defensive works had been established. The initial clashes that occurred in those early hours would expose a fundamental gap in Japanese military preparation. Their forces had trained extensively for combat at rifle ranges. They had drilled endlessly in the art of bayonet combat and close-quarters sword work, but they had made no provisions whatsoever for dealing with American shotguns that could be fired as rapidly as a soldier could work the pump mechanism. This mechanical reality would systematically dismantle Japanese tactical expectations throughout the Pacific Campaign. The Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal numbered approximately 2,200 defenders, and they were about to encounter a weapon system so brutally effective in close combat that the German government had attempted to have it prohibited from warfare back in 1918. The Winchester Model 12 possessed a unique characteristic called slam fire capability, which allowed it to discharge multiple shells in extremely rapid succession. This feature would prove particularly lethal in the type of warfare that dominated the Pacific: jungle fighting, the clearing of cave positions, and the desperate close-range combat that occurred during night operations. The raw mathematics of what this weapon could accomplish were staggering when examined closely. Each standard military shotgun shell contained 9 pellets of what was designated as double-aught buckshot. An experienced Marine operator could discharge 6 complete shells in less than 3 seconds when employing the slam fire technique properly. During that brief 3-second window, 54 individual projectiles would flood the target area with lethal force. To put this in perspective, a Japanese soldier armed with his standard bolt-action rifle would require nearly a full minute to fire that many rounds, and that's assuming perfect conditions and no need to reload. The comparative firepower advantage was simply overwhelming. The Winchester Model 12 arrived in World War II, carrying a reputation that had been forged in the muddy trenches of France during the previous world conflict. American forces deployed various shotgun models during World War I with such devastating effectiveness that the German government felt compelled to file an official diplomatic protest on September 15, 1918. This protest was transmitted through neutral Swiss diplomatic channels and preserved in the archives of the United States State Department. The German position argued that shotguns violated Article 23E of the Hague Convention on the grounds that they caused unnecessary suffering to combatants. The language of the German protest was quite explicit and threatening, stating that the German government formally protested the use of shotguns by American forces and drew attention to the fact that under the laws of war, any prisoner discovered in possession of such weapons or ammunition for them would forfeit their right to life. The American response came from Secretary of State Robert Lansing and was absolutely unequivocal in its rejection of the German position. The United States not only refused to cease using shotguns, but issued a clear warning that any execution of American prisoners for the crime of carrying shotguns would result in immediate reprisals against German prisoners. This firm stance proved effective, as no American soldiers were executed for carrying shotguns, and their employment continued throughout the remainder of World War I without further diplomatic incident. The Model 12 itself had originally been introduced to the civilian market in 1912 as a hunting weapon, but by 1942 it had undergone significant evolution for military purposes. The military variant, formerly designated as the M12 trench gun, featured several modifications from the civilian versions. The barrel had been shortened to 20 inches with a cylinder bore, compared to the 26 to 30-inch barrels found on civilian hunting models. A perforated metal heat shield had been added to protect the operator's hand during sustained firing when the barrel became dangerously hot. A bayonet lug had been incorporated into the design, allowing the attachment of a standard military bayonet if needed. Most significantly from a combat perspective, the military version retained the original design's deliberate lack of a trigger disconnector mechanism. This seemingly minor technical detail was actually the key to the weapon's slam-fire capability. The absence of a trigger disconnector was not an oversight or cost-saving measure, but rather an intentional design feature. Winchester's engineering team had specifically designed the Model 12 so that an operator who held down the trigger while working the pump action could fire the weapon as rapidly as they could physically cycle the mechanism. While civilian sport shooters rarely had occasion to use this feature and generally avoided it for safety reasons, military trainers immediately recognized the enormous combat potential it represented. The ability to deliver multiple shots in extremely rapid succession without ever releasing the trigger could mean the difference between life and death in close-range combat situations. Japanese military doctrine, as it had developed throughout the early Pacific campaigns, rested on several fundamental assumptions that were meticulously documented in their field manuals and training materials. The United States War Department's Technical Manual TME 30-480, which was titled Handbook on Japanese Military Forces and published in 1944, provided detailed analysis of Japanese tactical doctrine based on captured materials and battlefield observations. According to this analysis, Japanese military thinking emphasized two core tactical advantages that they believed would allow them to overcome American material superiority: proficiency in night fighting operations and excellence in close combat. The Japanese military made careful distinctions between different types of night operations. They categorized Kishu as a night surprise attack, while Kyoshu designated a night force attack with larger numbers. Japanese infantry training devoted countless hours to operations conducted in darkness, teaching soldiers how to move silently through terrain at night, how to navigate without light, and how to conduct infiltration techniques that relied on stealth rather than firepower. This emphasis on night operations was based on assumptions that had been validated through their experiences in China and during their early victories across the Pacific. Japanese planners believed that night combat effectively negated the American advantages in firepower and technological superiority, forcing combat into conditions where Japanese training and fighting spirit would prove decisive. Japanese training manuals contained explicit assessments that American forces were weak when combat closed to hand-to-hand range, and that Americans were overly dependent on mechanical and technological superiority. The Japanese doctrine held that once combat reached bayonet range, where it became a test of individual warrior skill and fighting spirit, the superior training and spiritual preparation of Japanese soldiers would inevitably prevail. This was not merely propaganda meant to inspire troops, but represented a genuine foundational element of Japanese tactical planning and strategic thinking. The spectacular fall of Singapore in February 1942 seemed to validate these doctrinal assumptions completely. Japanese forces had overwhelmed British positions through aggressive night attacks and savage close combat, defeating a force that significantly outnumbered them. Similar successes achieved in the Philippines reinforced the Japanese conviction that American forces, like other Western armies, simply could not match Japanese soldiers when combat descended into close-quarters battle. The American landing on Guadalcanal on that August morning in 1942 represented the first time that American forces had launched an offensive operation against Japanese-held territory. Among the various equipment that had been issued to Marine units preparing for the operation were Winchester Model 12 shotguns, distributed primarily to personnel who would be conducting jungle patrol operations, manning point defense positions, and performing security duties. The precise number of Model 12 shotguns present during the Guadalcanal operation remains somewhat unclear from surviving historical records, but there is definitive evidence confirming both their presence and their active employment in combat. Equipment manifests for the 1st Marine Division indicate that riot-type shotguns were included in the standard equipment loadout for infantry battalions, along with corresponding ammunition supplies of both buckshot and slug rounds. The first major combat test of these weapons came during what became known as the Battle of the Tenaru, though the actual geographic location was the Ilu River on August 21, 1942. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 916 men of his detachment in a nighttime assault across the sandbar at the river's mouth, executing precisely the kind of close combat night attack that Japanese doctrine prescribed as the path to victory. The outcome of this battle proved catastrophic for the Japanese forces involved. Of the 916 attackers who began the assault, approximately 800 were killed during the engagement. While Marine machine guns and supporting artillery certainly inflicted many of these casualties, the desperate close-range fighting that occurred when Japanese soldiers closed with Marine positions saw extensive employment of shotguns. After-action reports compiled following the battle noted the effectiveness of all available weapons systems in repelling the assault, with specific mentions of the particular value provided by increased firepower at close range. The technical characteristics of the Model 12 created its battlefield effectiveness through several interrelated factors. According to testing conducted by United States Army Ordnance specialists, the standard military load of double-aught buckshot contained 9 pellets, each measuring .33 caliber in diameter and constructed of lead. When tested at a range of 20 yards, these individual pellets maintained sufficient velocity to penetrate 3/4 of an inch into pine board, which ordnance testers used as a standard approximation for penetration into human tissue. The spread pattern created by these pellets was equally important to the weapon's combat effectiveness. At typical jungle combat ranges of 20 to 30 yards, buckshot would spread to form a pattern approximately 30 inches in diameter, creating a density of coverage that made precise aiming largely unnecessary. This characteristic proved absolutely crucial in jungle warfare conditions, where enemy soldiers were often nothing more than fleeting glimpses of movement through dense vegetation that obscured clear targeting. The slam fire capability multiplied all these inherent advantages dramatically. While no precise measurements of rate of fire from actual World War II combat conditions exist in the historical record, post-war testing conducted with experienced operators demonstrated that 5 to 6 rounds could be fired in under 3 seconds using the slam fire technique properly. This rate of fire actually exceeded many automatic weapons when measured at close range, with the additional tactical advantage that the spreading pattern of buckshot pellets made up for any imprecision in aiming during the stress of combat. Marines developed highly specific techniques for employing the Model 12 effectively through hard-won combat experience. Training programs emphasized firing at ground level when defending against enemy soldiers who were crawling to infiltrate positions, exploiting the fact that buckshot pellets would ricochet off hard ground and strike targets that might otherwise be protected by low cover. In jungle environments, Marines learned to fire at sounds and movement rather than waiting to acquire clear visual targets, relying on the spread pattern of the buckshot to compensate for the inherent imprecision of this type of engagement. As Marine units accumulated experience throughout 1942 and into 1943, the tactical employment of shotguns became increasingly sophisticated and refined. The weapons proved particularly valuable in specific types of tactical situations that occurred repeatedly throughout Pacific combat operations. During the New Georgia Campaign, which ran from June through August of 1943, shotguns were increasingly assigned to point men who walked at the front of jungle patrols. The ability to deliver immediate and devastating firepower in response to sudden ambush proved invaluable in this role. A Marine walking point position could react to movement or sound with instant suppressive fire, potentially hitting multiple enemy soldiers with a single shot thanks to the spreading pattern. Night defensive positions were restructured to incorporate shotguns as a primary weapon system for countering infiltration attempts. Japanese tactics frequently involved small groups of soldiers attempting to penetrate Marine defensive lines under cover of darkness, relying on stealth and blade weapons rather than firearms. Marines equipped with shotguns could cover defensive sectors with overlapping fields of fire, creating zones where infiltration became virtually impossible due to the probability of encountering devastating close-range fire. The weapons also proved highly effective in what Marines began calling jungle lane shooting, which involved clearing narrow paths through dense vegetation where Japanese soldiers might be hiding in ambush. The spread pattern of buckshot would strike multiple obstacles simultaneously, potentially hitting concealed enemies while simultaneously stripping away the foliage that provided their concealment and forcing them to either move or open fire, revealing their positions. The campaign through the Central Pacific Islands introduced an entirely new tactical challenge that would define much of the later Pacific War: Japanese cave fortifications. Beginning with the assault on Tarawa in November 1943 and escalating through every subsequent operation, Japanese forces increasingly relied on fortified caves and bunkers rather than traditional defensive line positions. At Peleliu, beginning September 15, 1944, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had prepared an extraordinarily elaborate system of cave defences. The island's coral limestone ridges were naturally honeycombed with caves that Japanese engineers had systematically expanded and fortified. These positions had been specifically designed to withstand sustained naval bombardment and aerial attack, which meant that eliminating them required intimate close-range combat operations. The Model 12 proved remarkably adaptable to this new tactical challenge. Marines developed specialized techniques for cave clearing that exploited the unique characteristics of the shotgun. The standard approach that involved firing 1 or 2 shells directly into a cave entrance, deliberately allowing the buckshot pellets to ricochet off the interior walls of the cave. The ricocheting pellets created what Marines described as a lead storm inside the confined spaces, with projectiles bouncing unpredictably off rock surfaces and filling the interior volume. The psychological effect of this technique often exceeded its physical casualty-causing capability. Japanese soldiers who survived these attacks and were later captured and interrogated reported that the sound of ricocheting buckshot inside caves was uniquely and extraordinarily terrifying. They described a metallic shrieking that seemed to emanate from all directions simultaneously, making it impossible to find cover or predict where the next impact would come from. This psychological dimension of the weapon's employment was an unintended but highly effective aspect of its tactical utility. The invasion of Saipan, launched on June 15, 1944, saw the continued evolution and refinement of shotgun tactics. The Japanese garrison defending the island numbered 31,000 troops under the command of Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, and they had prepared extensive fortifications after studying American assault tactics from previous operations. Marine units by this point had developed what they termed shotgun teams, which were specialized assault groups specifically organized for close-range combat. These teams typically consisted of 2 Marines armed with shotguns, 1 Marine carrying a Browning automatic rifle for suppressive fire support, and 1 or 2 riflemen equipped with hand grenades. The teams operated as specialized assault elements that proved particularly effective against fortified positions where the final assault phase required close-range firepower. The battle for Saipan also saw increased diversification in the types of ammunition being employed with shotguns. While double-aught buckshot remained the standard load for most situations, Marines also made extensive use of solid slug rounds for engaging targets at longer ranges with greater precision, and smaller birdshot loads for stripping away vegetation to expose hidden positions without creating as much risk of ricochet in confined spaces. On the night of July 7, 1944, Saipan witnessed the largest Japanese banzai charge of the entire war, with approximately 3,000 to 4,000 attackers assaulting American positions in a massive night assault. While the majority of casualties among the attackers were inflicted by machine guns and other crew-served weapons, The close-range fighting that occurred when Japanese soldiers successfully penetrated into American lines saw extensive use of every available weapon system, including shotguns. The ability to deliver multiple projectiles without the need for precise aiming proved particularly valuable in the confused melee conditions of night combat, where visibility was minimal and targets appeared suddenly at extremely close range. The battle for Iwo Jima, which raged from February 19 through March 26, 1945, presented what would prove to be the ultimate test of cave warfare tactics that had been developed through years of brutal Pacific combat. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had created the most sophisticated and elaborate defensive system of the entire war, consisting of 11 miles of interconnected tunnels linking more than 1,500 separate caves, pillboxes, and fortified positions. Kuribayashi had made a careful study of American tactics from previous island battles and had specifically designed his defensive network to counter them. Cave entrances were angled and offset to prevent direct fire from reaching interior positions. Multiple exits from each position prevented defenders from being trapped and eliminated with single attacks, and interior chambers were deliberately offset to limit the effectiveness of explosives and flamethrowers when they were employed. Despite these sophisticated preparations and countermeasures, the Model 12 shotgun remained an effective tool in the American arsenal. Marines adapted their tactics by developing what they called skip shooting, which involved deliberately banking buckshot off tunnel walls to reach around corners and strike targets that were not in the direct line of fire. They also increased their use of specialized white phosphorus shotgun shells, which created both direct casualties through burning and generated smoke that forced Japanese soldiers to evacuate positions or suffocate. The 21,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima were gradually eliminated through brutal close-range fighting that continued for over a month. Of the entire garrison, only 216 were taken prisoner, and the vast majority of these were either severely wounded or unconscious when captured. The nature of the fighting at Iwo Jima, with its overwhelming emphasis on eliminating fortified positions at extremely close range through direct assault, highlighted the continued relevance and importance of weapons like the Model 12, despite the overall increasing mechanization and technological sophistication of modern warfare. The invasion of Okinawa, which commenced on April 1, 1945, represented the largest amphibious operation conducted during the entire Pacific War. General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded a garrison of 100,000 Japanese troops defending the most extensive and sophisticated defensive network yet constructed by Japanese forces. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, who served as Ushijima's operations officer and was considered one of Japan's most brilliant military staff officers, had designed the defense specifically to maximize American casualties and prolong the battle as long as possible. By the time of the Okinawa operation, both sides had accumulated 3 full years of combat experience in the Pacific theater and had learned hard lessons about what tactics worked and what didn't. Japanese forces had largely abandoned the wasteful banzai charges that had characterized earlier battles and now fought primarily from prepared defensive positions. American forces had refined their combined arms tactics to a high degree of sophistication, with shotguns playing a specific and well-understood role in the close combat phases of cave and bunker reduction operations. The 82-day campaign on Okinawa saw the full flowering of American cave-clearing techniques that had been developed and refined through years of Pacific combat. Marines and Army troops employed what they referred to as blowtorch and corkscrew tactics in a systematic approach to reducing fortified positions. Flamethrowers provided the blowtorch element, creating intense heat and consuming oxygen inside fortified spaces. Demolitions and close-range weapons like shotguns served as the corkscrew element, physically penetrating positions and eliminating defenders who attempted to hold out. The actual production numbers and distribution patterns of Model 12 shotguns tell a somewhat different story from popular perception and mythology about these weapons. According to company records from Winchester that were later analysed by historian Herbert G. Howes, Only 61,014 Model 12 shotguns were actually manufactured during the entire period of World War II. An additional 19,207 existing weapons were repaired or refurbished by Winchester during the war years, which has led to some confusion about total numbers in various historical accounts. These weapons were distributed across all branches of the United States military services, including Marines, Army, Navy, and Army Air Forces, rather than being issued exclusively to Marine Corps units as popular culture sometimes suggests. The Army Air Forces, for instance, employed Model 12 shotguns for air-base defense duties and for guarding aircraft on the ground. The Navy used them for ship security operations and for arming landing parties when sailors went ashore. This relatively limited production run of just over 60,000 new weapons for a military force that ultimately numbered 12 million personnel meant that Model 12 shotguns were specialized weapons issued for specific purposes rather than general-issue items that every soldier might carry. The weapons were concentrated in units that were expected to face frequent close combat situations, particularly Marine rifle companies, Army assault teams, and various security detachments. The ammunition supply situation was considerably more abundant than the weapons themselves. Military contracts for shotgun shells ran into the millions of rounds, ensuring that units equipped with shotguns had adequate ammunition supplies for both training purposes and actual combat operations. The standard military load remained double-aught buckshot, with slug rounds and various smaller shot sizes also available for specific tactical purposes. Evaluating the actual combat effectiveness of the Model 12 requires careful analysis of the available historical evidence rather than relying on mythology or assumptions. After-action reports from Pacific battles consistently note the value of shotguns in specific tactical situations, while also frankly acknowledging their limitations. The weapons excelled in several scenarios that were consistently reported across different battles and campaigns. In jungle ambush response situations, the ability to deliver immediate and devastating firepower in response to sudden contact at close range proved invaluable. The spread pattern of buckshot compensated for the extreme difficulty of acquiring clear targets in dense vegetation where visibility might be measured in feet rather than yards. For night defense operations, shotguns provided highly effective defense against infiltration attempts by Japanese soldiers. The distinctive sound of a pump-action mechanism being cycled became a psychological deterrent in its own right, while the spread pattern dramatically increased the probability of hits when firing in darkness at partially glimpsed targets or at sounds and movement. In cave and bunker clearing operations, the ricochet effect of buckshot in confined spaces multiplied the weapon's effectiveness far beyond what would normally be expected. Even when direct hits on enemy soldiers were not achieved, the psychological impact of buckshot ricocheting unpredictably inside enclosed spaces often forced Japanese soldiers to evacuate positions, making them vulnerable to other weapons. During the final assault phases of attacks when combat closed to ranges under 25 yards, shotguns provided superior firepower compared to bolt-action rifles, and in some circumstances even compared to automatic weapons, particularly when multiple targets needed to be engaged rapidly. However, the weapons also had clear and significant limitations that must be acknowledged. The effective range of 50 yards or less meant that troops armed with shotguns were vulnerable to rifle fire at longer ranges and could be engaged by enemy soldiers who stayed beyond shotgun range. The ammunition was considerably bulkier and heavier compared to rifle rounds, which limited the amount that could be carried and created additional logistical burden. The weapons required frequent and careful cleaning in the corrosive salt-air environment that characterized most Pacific combat zones, as rust and corrosion could quickly render them inoperable. Japanese forces attempted to develop various countermeasures to American close combat weapons, including shotguns, as the war progressed. These adaptations, which are documented in captured Japanese materials and in post-war interrogations of Japanese soldiers and officers, reveal both the seriousness with which they perceived the threat and the difficulty they faced in countering it effectively. Some Japanese units experimented with improvised body armor, including thick plates made from wood or bamboo that were designed to stop buckshot pellets. These proved cumbersome to wear and only partially effective, as buckshot could still cause disabling injuries to exposed areas of the body, like the head and limbs, that couldn't be fully protected. Tactical adaptations included efforts to increase the depth of defensive positions to make it more difficult for American assault teams to penetrate, creating elaborate dummy positions to draw fire while the actual defensive positions remained hidden, and using obstacles and terrain features to try to maintain engagement distances beyond effective shotgun range, where Japanese rifles would have an advantage. Despite all these efforts, Japanese forces never developed truly effective counters to American close combat tactics. The fundamental problem they faced was one of material resources and industrial capacity. Japan simply lacked the industrial capacity to match American firepower at any range, which forced them to continue relying on tactics that inevitably brought them into precisely the close-range combat where American weapons like the Model 12 were most effective. The German protest from 1918 regarding shotgun use had created an interesting legal precedent that influenced World War II employment considerations. The American rejection of German protests had effectively established that shotguns were legitimate weapons of war under international law and the laws of armed conflict. Interestingly, despite the Model 12's demonstrated effectiveness against Japanese forces throughout the Pacific, Japan never filed any similar protest or challenged the use of shotguns on legal or humanitarian grounds. This absence is particularly notable given that Japan did produce combat shotguns in extremely limited numbers for their own forces, though these were never employed on any significant scale. The weapon, despite its devastating close-range effects and the horrific wounds it could inflict, remained within the accepted bounds of legitimate warfare. The Marine Corps developed specific training programs for shotgun employment based on accumulated combat experience as the war progressed. The Scout Sniper School at Camp Lejeune included shotgun training in its curriculum, though the exact details of the World War II-era curriculum have not survived in the historical record in complete form. Training programs emphasized several key principles that had been derived directly from combat experience. Ammunition management was crucial, as unlike rifle ammunition, shotgun shells were bulky and heavy. Marines learned to carry shells in elastic loops attached to belts and in bandoliers for rapid access during combat. The standard combat load was typically 50 to 60 shells, though resupply remained a constant concern during extended operations. Shooting positions for pump-action shotguns differed significantly from standard rifle shooting positions. Marines practiced firing from the hip during movement, point shooting without using the weapon's sights for extremely close-range engagements, and maintaining balance while cycling the action rapidly under stress. Target selection training taught shotgunners to engage the closest threats first, as the limited range meant that more distant targets could potentially close while the shotgunner was dealing with other threats. Marines also learned to sweep the weapon across multiple targets rather than focusing on individual enemies, as the spread pattern meant that precise aiming was less critical than rapid target engagement across a sector. Weapon maintenance training took on special importance given the Pacific environment's particularly harsh effects on weapons. Salt spray, sand, and high humidity could quickly render a Model 12 inoperable if proper maintenance was not performed. Daily maintenance routines became essential, with particular emphasis on keeping the action mechanism clean and properly lubricated to ensure reliability. The American use of shotguns in World War II was relatively unique among the major combatant nations, and examining other nations' approaches to close combat reveals different tactical philosophies and priorities. The British military made only very limited use of shotguns, primarily employing them for prisoner guard duties and for certain specialized operations. British doctrine for close combat emphasized the submachine gun instead, particularly the Sten gun, which they produced in large quantities. The Soviet Union relied very heavily on the PPSH-41 submachine gun for close combat situations, producing over 6 million of these weapons during the war. The high rate of fire and large magazine capacity of this weapon suited Soviet mass assault tactics that often involved large numbers of infantry advancing together. Germany, despite having protested American shotgun use during World War I, actually produced limited numbers of shotguns for use on the Eastern Front during World War II. However, the MP-40 submachine gun remained their primary close combat weapon throughout the war. Japan produced virtually no combat shotguns at all, maintaining their traditional focus on rifles, bayonets, and traditional blade weapons for close combat. This reflected both their industrial limitations and cultural preferences in military thinking. The American adoption and extensive use of shotguns reflected a fundamentally pragmatic approach to warfare that prioritized using the most effective tool for each specific tactical situation, regardless of how that tool fit into traditional military conventions or thinking. Understanding the Model 12's role requires placing it within the broader context of American combat doctrine in the Pacific Theater. The weapon was never employed in isolation, but was always one element in a comprehensive combined arms approach that integrated naval gunfire support, air support from carrier-based and land-based aircraft, artillery fire, armor when available, and various infantry weapons systems. The typical process for reducing a fortified Japanese position involved a systematic sequence of fires and assaults. Naval gunfire or artillery would bombard the position to suppress it and damage fortifications. Airstrikes might be employed to deliver additional ordnance if the target warranted it. Armor, when terrain permitted, would move forward to provide direct fire support. Assault teams would then approach using flamethrowers and demolition charges to breach fortifications. Shotguns would be employed in the final assault phase when combat closed to extremely short ranges to clear the position of remaining defenders. Finally, engineers would seal or completely destroy the position to prevent its reoccupation. The shotgun's role within this system was specific but genuinely important, providing overwhelming close-range firepower during the critical moments when American and Japanese soldiers met at distances measured in feet rather than yards. The psychological impact of weapons in combat often exceeds their purely physical effects, and the Model 12 had demonstrable effects on the morale of both American and Japanese forces, though these psychological factors must be assessed carefully given the natural tendency toward propaganda and mythology surrounding weapons. For American forces, the shotgun provided a tangible sense of confidence in close combat situations. Marines and soldiers knew they possessed devastating firepower at short range, which reduced anxiety about Japanese infiltration tactics and the feared banzai charges. The mechanical simplicity and proven reliability of the Model 12 also inspired confidence among users, as it rarely jammed or malfunctioned and was simple enough to operate effectively even under extreme stress. The distinctive sound of the pump-action mechanism being cycled became a morale factor in its own right. Veterans consistently reported in post-war accounts that this sound reassured friendly troops who heard it during night operations, while potentially deterring enemy action as Japanese soldiers learned to recognize what the sound meant. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the United States military conducted extensive analysis of weapons effectiveness throughout the Pacific War to inform future doctrine and equipment decisions. The Model 12 and other combat shotguns received mixed assessments in these analyses. The weapons were credited with exceptional effectiveness in specific tactical situations, particularly cave-clearing operations and night defense against infiltration. The ability to deliver multiple projectiles without requiring precise aiming proved valuable in the confused close-range fighting that was common throughout the Pacific Theater. However, military analysts also carefully noted the limitations. The short effective range left shotgun-armed troops vulnerable in open terrain where enemy forces could engage them from beyond shotgun range. The weapons proved less effective against Japanese bunkers that featured small firing apertures, as the spread pattern that was an advantage in other situations meant that fewer pellets would actually enter the small opening. The logistical burden of supplying specialized ammunition complicated supply operations, particularly in the resource-constrained early stages of island campaigns. Despite these acknowledged limitations, shotguns were retained in United States military inventory after World War II and continued to see service in subsequent conflicts. The Model 12 served extensively in Korea, where it once again proved effective in close-range combat operations and night-fighting situations that bore some similarities to Pacific combat. In Vietnam, shotguns were routinely employed by point men on patrols moving through jungle terrain and for the specialized and extremely dangerous work of clearing tunnel complexes, directly applying tactical lessons that had been learned in the Pacific. The Model 12's mechanical design proved influential for subsequent military shotgun development. The pump-action mechanism proved more reliable in harsh combat conditions than semi-automatic designs that were more sensitive to fouling and environmental factors. The slam-fire capability, while eventually eliminated from civilian models for safety reasons, remained valued for military applications where the TU deliver extremely rapid fire at close range could be life-saving. The historical record of Model 12 employment during World War II comes from multiple sources, each with its own particular limitations and strengths. Official after-action reports provide valuable tactical overviews of battles and engagements, but they rarely include detailed information about individual weapons employment. References to shotguns in these reports typically appear only when noting either special effectiveness or particular problems encountered. Unit equipment records document the distribution of shotguns to various units, but they don't provide information about actual combat use or effectiveness. Many of these records were lost or destroyed during the chaotic conditions of the war. Technical manuals produced by the military describe the weapon's operation and provide basic guidance on employment, but they don't capture specific combat experiences or lessons learned. Veteran accounts compiled through post-war memoirs and oral history projects provide invaluable anecdotal evidence, but these must be evaluated carefully for accuracy and to determine how representative individual experiences were of broader patterns. Japanese records, including captured documents and post-war interrogations of prisoners, provide essential enemy perspective on American weapons and tactics, but they are limited by translation issues and by the fact that many Japanese records were deliberately destroyed as defeat became inevitable. Photographic evidence from combat operations occasionally shows Marines carrying or using shotguns, but photographs cannot document effectiveness or provide detailed tactical information. This fragmentary nature of the historical evidence requires careful analysis to separate documented facts from mythology and unsupported assumptions. The Model 12's employment throughout the Pacific highlighted the vast gap in industrial and technological capacity between the United States and Japan. American forces could afford to issue highly specialized weapons for very specific tactical situations, weapons that would see limited use but provided crucial advantages when needed. The industrial capacity to produce over 60,000 shotguns, weapons with inherently limited military application compared to rifles, while simultaneously producing millions of rifles, hundreds of thousands of machine guns, and tens of thousands of artillery pieces, demonstrated an overwhelming material superiority that Japan simply could not match. American supply procedures reflected this abundance. Standard operating procedures called for using fresh ammunition and discarding shells that showed any signs of corrosion or damage. Japanese forces, by contrast, were reduced to counting every rifle cartridge and frequently relied on captured ammunition to supplement their dwindling supplies. The development of innovative shotgun tactics in the Pacific demonstrates an important characteristic of American military culture: organizational adaptability. Unlike rigid military hierarchies that imposed tactics from the top down without input from combat units, American forces actively encouraged innovation at the small unit level. Marines who discovered effective techniques in combat shared them informally with other units through word of mouth and direct demonstration. Successful methods spread rapidly through frontline units as soldiers taught each other what worked. Officers then incorporated these proven techniques into formal training programs and doctrinal publications. This bottom-up innovation process allowed extremely rapid tactical adaptation to changing battlefield conditions. The skip shooting technique for cave clearing provides an excellent example. This technique appears to have developed independently in multiple Marine units that were facing similar challenges in reducing cave positions. Marines discovered through experimentation that buckshot would ricochet predictably off rock walls, which allowed them to shoot around corners and hit targets that weren't in the direct line of fire. This technique, born purely of combat necessity and field experimentation, rapidly became standard procedure. Similarly, the practice of using mixed ammunition loads, alternating buckshot and slug rounds in the magazine, developed from accumulated combat experience rather than from any pre-war doctrine or training. Marines learned through experience that this combination provided valuable flexibility in engaging varied targets without requiring a weapon change. While tactical weapons like the Model 12 played genuinely important roles in combat operations, it's crucial to maintain perspective about the Pacific War's outcome being determined by much larger strategic factors. American submarine warfare systematically strangled Japanese logistics by sinking merchant vessels faster than they could be replaced. Strategic bombing progressively destroyed Japanese industrial capacity and urban infrastructure. Naval supremacy allowed the United States to isolate Japanese garrisons and control the timing and location of engagements. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ultimately ended Japanese resistance without requiring the invasion of the home islands. Within this larger strategic framework, weapons like the Model 12 contributed to tactical successes that supported operational and strategic objectives. Efficient reduction of Japanese fortified positions conserved American manpower, which was a constant concern for military planners. Maintaining offensive momentum kept pressure on Japanese forces and prevented them from consolidating defenses. Demonstrating the futility of continued resistance through the systematic elimination of every defensive position helped undermine Japanese will to continue fighting. The shotgun's effectiveness in cave-clearing operations, for instance, directly reduced American casualties during the grinding attrition battles of 1944 and 1945. Each fortified position that could be cleared quickly meant fewer American casualties and faster progress towards seizing strategic objectives like airfields and port facilities. The Model 12's employment in the Pacific offers several valuable lessons about military innovation and adaptation that remain relevant to contemporary warfare. Existing technology can be applied in innovative ways to address new tactical problems. The Model 12 was already a 30-year-old design when World War II began. The innovation came not from new technology, but from applying existing technology to tackle new tactical challenges in creative ways. User-driven innovation often proves more effective than top-down doctrine development. The most effective tactics for employing the Model 12 developed from bottom-up experimentation by actual combat users rather than from directives issued by higher headquarters. Military forces must balance specialized capabilities against general-purpose requirements. The Model 12 excelled in specific situations, but had clear limitations that prevented it from being a general-purpose weapon. Understanding when specialized tools are worth their cost is crucial. Technology alone provides limited advantage without proper doctrine and training. The Model 12's effectiveness depended entirely on Marines receiving proper training in its employment and on the development of sound tactical doctrine. The weapon itself was simply a tool. Industrial base capacity determines what's possible in terms of innovation. The ability to produce and supply specialized weapons and ammunition depends fundamentally on having a robust industrial capacity. Tactical innovation requires corresponding logistical support, or it remains theoretical rather than practical. Behind all the technical specifications and tactical analysis were actual human beings, American Marines and soldiers who carried Model 12 shotguns into combat, and Japanese soldiers who faced these weapons. Their experiences, while inevitably filtered through the imperfections of memory and influenced by mythology, provide essential human perspective on what these weapons meant in practice. Marines who carried shotguns into combat often did so by deliberate choice, consciously trading the longer effective range of rifles for the devastating close-range firepower that shotguns provided. This decision reflected individual assessment of likely tactical requirements and personal preference informed by experience. Some Marines absolutely swore by the shotgun's effectiveness and refused to carry anything else when operating in jungle terrain or clearing caves. Others preferred the greater versatility that rifles provided and only took shotguns for specific missions where close combat was virtually certain. Operating the weapon effectively under actual combat stress-tested human capabilities in ways that training could only partially prepare for. Slam firing required considerable physical strength and precise coordination while simultaneously dealing with fear, exhaustion, and incoming fire. The technique that seemed straightforward during training on peaceful ranges became genuinely challenging when the operator was exhausted from days of combat, terrified of being killed, or dealing with wounds. Yet Marines consistently performed these complex actions effectively in the most adverse conditions imaginable. The Winchester Model 12's employment throughout the Pacific War demonstrated both American military adaptability and the nation's overwhelming industrial capability. The weapon proved exceptionally effective in specific tactical situations that occurred repeatedly throughout Pacific combat, clearing fortified caves, defending positions against night infiltration, responding to jungle ambushes, and during the final assault phases of attacks on fortified positions. Its unique slam fire capability provided devastating close-range firepower that Japanese forces consistently struggled to counter effectively. However, the Model 12's actual impact must be understood within its proper historical context. Only 61,014 new weapons were produced during the entire war, making it a specialized weapon issued for specific purposes rather than a primary infantry arm that every soldier carried. Its battlefield effectiveness depended entirely on proper integration with other weapons systems within combined arms tactics. The Pacific War's ultimate outcome was determined by strategic factors that operated at a scale far beyond any individual tactical weapon, no matter how effective. The Japanese military's consistent failure to anticipate or develop effective counters to American shotgun employment reflected much broader and more fundamental miscalculations about American military capabilities. Japanese doctrine placed heavy emphasis on spiritual factors and individual warrior skills, while systematically underestimating American material superiority and capacity for tactical innovation. The Model 12, though mechanically simple in its basic design, proved devastating in its application and embodied the fundamentally pragmatic American approach to warfare. From the initial landings at Guadalcanal through to the final battles on Okinawa, passing through countless jungles and caves between, the distinctive sound of a pump-action mechanism being cycled marked American tactical innovation in action. Marines and soldiers armed with Model 12 shotguns demonstrated repeatedly that an industrial democracy could develop and deploy specialized weapons tailored for specific tactical challenges and then develop innovative doctrine for employing them effectively. The weapon that Germany had protested as inhumane back in 1918 proved to be simply another tool in the extensive American arsenal, one tool among many that collectively overwhelmed Japanese resistance. The Model 12's legacy extends well beyond World War II itself. The tactics that were developed through years of brutal Pacific combat influenced American military doctrine through subsequent conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, and continue to inform contemporary military thinking about close-quarters combat. The fundamental emphasis on overwhelming close combat firepower, the use of specialized weapons for specific tactical situations, and the practice of user-driven tactical innovation all remain relevant to modern warfare. Japanese infantry defending Pacific Islands during World War II never expected Winchester M12 trench guns to slam-fire their way through carefully prepared defences because such weapons violated their fundamental assumptions about how warfare would unfold. The Model 12 delivered a straightforward message to Japanese defenders. American forces would apply overwhelming firepower at every range, they would use every available technology, regardless of tradition, and they would continuously adapt through innovation based on combat experience. In the brutal arithmetic of Pacific combat, where victory was often measured in yards of ground seized and fortified positions eliminated, the Model 12 added its weight to the scales that ultimately tilted toward American victory. The transformation that occurred was not accomplished through the Model 12 alone, but through what it represented. American willingness to embrace any weapon that proved effective, to develop innovative tactics through frontline experimentation, and to apply massive industrial production capacity towards solving tactical problems. Japanese infantry who faced these weapons in combat discovered that their opponents had mastered not merely the traditional art of war, but the modern science of systematically applying firepower to destroy any defense, overcome any obstacle, and achieve victory through the combination of material superiority with continuous tactical innovation.